In early March of 2022, 70-year-old Abigail Norris was feeling good as she walked out of the Newark, New Jersey airport. It was chilly outside, but she didn't mind. She'd just spent 9 weeks at a friend's house in Southern California. Every day had been filled with sunshine and strolls along the beach. It was the most relaxing winter of her life. Even her chronic back pain felt better in the mild weather. For decades, Abigail had suffered joint pain from osteoarthritis, and she also had lower back pain that made it hard to even comfortably sit upright, let alone move around. But considering how well she felt right now, she was starting to think that maybe she should just go to California every winter. 3 months later, Abigail woke up suddenly in the middle of the night with a sharp pain in her stomach. She fumbled for the lamp on her bedside table, flicking on the light just as another stabbing pain hit her. She groaned and curled up into the fetal position until the room started spinning. Then a wave of nausea hit her, and she hurried to the bathroom just in time to lean over the toilet to vomit. And she would vomit into that toilet bowl over and over again until she was coughing up this yellowish-green bile that came from her liver. And every time she felt like she was done throwing up, another wave of nausea would hit and she would throw up again. It was actually Abigail's third vomiting fit in the past few months. She'd gone to the emergency room the last 2 times, but the doctors didn't know what was wrong. Both times, the pain went away on its own and she was discharged. She had no idea what was causing these symptoms. At first, she wondered if maybe this was some awful side effect of a migraine, which are very severe, debilitating headaches. She used to suffer from them all the time, but they never affected her gut or made her this violently ill. And this particular vomiting spell was the worst one so far. More than an hour passed by before Abigail felt certain she was done throwing up. By then, she felt weak and shaky, and the pain in her abdomen was becoming unbearable. Abigail gathered her strength and managed to get herself dressed. She found her purse and staggered out to her car. Even though she feared it would be another waste of time, she knew she had to get to the hospital again. The next morning, Abigail was laying in a hospital bed, vomiting yet again, but this time into a disposable bag. She had been admitted to the hospital, and then an ER doctor had ordered blood and urine tests along with a CT scan of her abdomen. While waiting for the results, he gave her medication for her pain. He also started her on broad-spectrum antibiotics in case she had a bacterial infection. But none of it helped with her stomach cramps and nausea or the vomiting. Abigail could not stop puking even though her stomach was completely empty. She was exhausted and her stomach hurt so badly that when she wasn't throwing up, all she could do was lie in bed with her eyes closed. Just then, Abigail heard someone come into the room, but she felt too weak to open her eyes. A nurse asked her if she wanted more pain medication. Abigail just shook her head and said no. The pain medication they had given her in the emergency room had not helped, so there was no point in taking any more. Besides, Abigail felt like she'd just throw up anything they put in her system, so she'd rather tough it out and let her stomach rest. Later that morning, when Dr. Howard Pinter entered his new patient's room, Abigail's room, he was hit with the stench of fresh vomit. The acid smell lingered in his nose as he approached her. Abigail lay motionless on the bed, her eyes closed. She looked too weak to move. Her face was pale and glistened with sweat. The hair around her face was soaked through and matted to her forehead. It was clear she'd had a long and sleepless night. Dr. Pinter said her name, and he watched as her eyes fluttered weakly, but she didn't say anything. He realized this was likely the closest thing to a hello that she could muster. He asked her if she could tell him where the pain was coming from, but all Abigail could do was make this low moaning noise, as though talking took too much work. So, Dr. Pinter began an exam, and he pressed gently on her abdomen, asking if that made the pain worse. If he could figure out exactly where the pain was coming from, it would help him diagnose her. But Abigail didn't even seem to notice his hands on her, so he just continued to press up and down on her belly, trying to pinpoint the origin of her pain, but she didn't react to anything he was doing. Her entire abdomen was apparently throbbing in pain, but him pressing on her abdomen made no difference to her. Because her pain was so widespread, the doctor knew he could probably rule out conditions like appendicitis or kidney stones, which tend to show up in one specific place. But there was a laundry list of other conditions that could cause abdominal pain like this, and so Dr. Pinter hoped that the true cause would show up either on her CT scan or her lab work. An hour later, Dr. Pinter sat at his desk looking over Abigail's blood test results, as well as images of her abdomen from the CT scans. On these scans, he couldn't see anything that would cause pain throughout the entire region, but something seemed to be wrong with the quality of the images. He looked through her medical records, and he quickly found an explanation. Abigail had had a small device called a nerve stimulator implanted in her abdomen years ago to help treat her chronic migraines. It worked by sending electric pulses to her nervous system to alter the way her brain experienced pain. However, since the device was electronic, the interference from it was reducing the picture quality of our CT scans, which made it hard for Dr. Pinter to pinpoint the cause of Abigail's stomach pain. But the scans were not the only thing that troubled the doctor. There was also her lab results to consider. Her white blood cell count was extremely high, which suggested she was fighting off an infection or inflammation. And the doctor saw yet another problem too. When body tissue does not receive enough oxygen, it begins to die and releases an acid into the bloodstream. Abigail had a rising level of this acid in her system, which meant that some of her tissue could already be dying. Dr. Pinter worried that she might have a condition called ischemia, which occurs when the supply of blood to the organs is cut off. This condition can lead to a heart attack or stroke. Unfortunately, the CT images were not good enough to identify any blockage in the blood supply that could be causing ischemia. However, Dr. Pinter knew he had no time to lose. He grabbed his phone and called down to the cardiology department and scheduled Abigail for emergency surgery later that afternoon. He needed a vascular surgeon to literally open up her abdomen and look to see if something was blocking her circulation, and also to remove any dying tissue. A few hours later, Dr. Pinter received a call from the surgeon who had performed Abigail's procedure. The good news was that Abigail came through the surgery just fine. Her organs looked perfectly healthy, and her blood vessels were functioning properly. She did not have ischemia. In fact, it looked like there was nothing wrong with her arteries at all. Dr. Pinter was glad to hear that Abigail looked healthy, but in reality, she was still very sick with something, and now he had no idea what could be causing these stomach cramps, the high white blood cell count, and the rising level of acid in her body. What he really needed was to get Abigail strong enough so she could speak. That way she could answer questions about her pain and her previous vomiting spells. Without her talking, he feared they'd never get to the bottom of her issue. Three days later, around lunchtime, Abigail was eating some Jell-O in her hospital bed. Until this point, she'd been getting her nutrients through an IV. This was the first true meal she'd had since she arrived at the hospital, and if it were up to her, it was going to be the last. She just wanted to go home. That morning, the pain in her abdomen had finally subsided. She'd stopped vomiting and could now keep fluids down. For the first time in days, she actually felt hungry. It was like her illness had disappeared. And her updated lab results seemed to support that idea. Her blood and urine showed no signs of an infection. And so, just like the last two times Abigail had a very serious vomiting and cramping spell, it seemed like everything just sort of went back to normal. The medical staff didn't have an explanation for why she was suddenly better. And so Abigail felt like she was just wasting time and money by staying in the hospital. But a moment later, Dr. Pinter appeared in the doorway, and he told Abigail that he might have an explanation for her pain. Abigail was surprised, but intrigued, and asked him to explain. Dr. Pinter said he had two theories. The first was that she might have a rare nerve condition called abdominal migraines. He explained that when Abigail first arrived at the hospital, he had pressed a hand on her stomach to see where the pain was coming from. That's what made him think that she might be suffering from nerve pain, one of the few types of pain that does not respond to pressure. Plus, Abigail had a history of regular migraines, and he explained that abdominal migraines are related to migraine headaches, but they show up as abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting, rather than the more typical headaches. Dr. Pinter said the other possible theory for what was causing her pain was that she could be suffering from abdominal epilepsy, a very rare type of seizure that causes severe abdominal pain. It's most common in children, but adults can suffer from it as well. And so he asked her if she wouldn't mind staying at the hospital long enough to let the neurology team examine her. Abigail admitted that Dr. Pinter might be onto something, but she just could not spend any more time in the hospital. So she made a deal with him. If he discharged her, she would book an appointment with the neurologist who had been treating her migraines over the past 20 years to see if maybe he thought either of those theories were what was going on with her. Dr. Pinter said they had a deal. The following day, Abigail was home and she sat down at the desk in her bedroom. She logged onto a Zoom call for a meeting with her neurologist, Dr. Randall Bergen. Dr. Bergen was not just a neurologist, he was also a psychiatrist, and he had been Abigail's doctor for over 2 decades, though she hadn't seen him in a long time. When her nerve stimulator was implanted a few years ago, her migraines had cleared up almost completely, so there really hadn't been a need to speak to him. But now, she told him all about her vomiting spells and Dr. Pinter's theories that maybe she had abdominal migraines or seizures. She also told him about her blood tests, CT scans, and exploratory surgery. None of the doctors could find evidence of anything physically wrong with her. And finally, she told him how her pain just suddenly went away after a few days in the hospital. And she said the same thing had happened twice before since coming back from California. Dr. Bergen was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking over all the information. Then, he asked her a question that nobody had thought to ask her before. Dr. Bergen wanted to know if Abigail smoked marijuana. Abigail was surprised. She assured him that she had never smoked marijuana, but she had eaten it. When she was in California, Abigail's friends kept telling her that weed gummies could help with her chronic back and joint pain, and so she'd given it a try. And sure enough, the gummies had really helped. Whenever she ate a gummy, it was so much easier to move and walk around or even just do housework. So, ever since she got home from California, she'd been eating 6 weed gummies a day. When she was in the hospital, she hadn't told Dr. Pinter about the weed gummies because she was embarrassed. Besides, the gummies were supposed to reduce nausea, so she didn't think it was relevant anyways. That's when Dr. Bergen explained that Abigail was suffering from something called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. It's caused by prolonged use of high-dose cannabis and is characterized by nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. Researchers don't know why some people have this reaction to the chemicals in marijuana, but it's thought that the intolerance could be genetic. The good news was that if Abigail discontinued her use of the weed gummies, her painful vomiting spells would stop. And in fact, that's what was happening each time she was hospitalized. She didn't have access to marijuana gummies, and so after a couple of days, the pain would subside. However, the weed gummies made Abigail's life so much better that at first, she actually really didn't want to stop using them despite the downside. So she tried lessening the dosage and the frequency, but still, she would get violently ill and have stomach pains, and so eventually she did stop taking them altogether. And while her lower back pain and osteoarthritis did come back, she at least stayed out of the hospital and has not experienced pain or nausea since. And now here's our second story called A Spoonful of Sugar. On a warm spring afternoon in 2011, a woman named Brooke Scott arrived at her lively real estate office in Massachusetts with a box of warm chocolate chip cookies for her staff. Brooke walked from cubicle to cubicle, handing out cookies and patting people on the back to celebrate a huge sale for that month. But when Brooke arrived at the cubicle belonging to an agent named Kelly Romano, she stopped short. Normally, 52-year-old Kelly had the energy of a woman half her age, constantly chatting with clients and combing through the latest listings. Today, though, Kelly was hunched over in her chair. Her face was pale and slick with sweat, and she stared at the box of cookies in Brooke's arms with glassy eyes. Kelly reached for one of the cookies, but when she stood up, she swayed back and forth before her knees buckled and she sank back into her chair. Brooke just shook her head. She couldn't smell any alcohol in Kelly's breath, but it was clear. Kelly was drunk in the office. Again. Brooke whispered to Kelly that they had talked about these day-drinking episodes several times over the past year, but Kelly insisted she was sober, and Brooke was making a big deal out of nothing. But Brooke had had enough. She told Kelly to take some time off, and then picked up the phone to call her a ride home. The following day, Kelly went out to run errands with her husband Peter. She still didn't feel quite right, but she was sure the time off would help. As they drove through town, her cell phone rang. It was one of her clients, asking her to set up an appointment to go see a house he wanted to buy. Kelly promised she would set it up. However, the moment they hung up, she completely forgot what property they'd been talking about. Kelly felt rattled by this. She never forgot details like that. So she promised herself she would call that client back once she was feeling less fuzzy. An hour later, Kelly and her husband Peter had finished their grocery shopping and were loading their bags back into the car. Peter needed to make some calls, so Kelly hopped in the driver's seat and pulled out of the parking lot. And after a few minutes, Peter put his phone on mute and looked over at her, and with a confused look on his face, asked Kelly where she was going. Kelly looked around and realized she didn't know where she was. Now, she still knew how to drive. She could tell a red light from a green light. But when she tried to remember the way home, she couldn't. She felt like a lost child. At this point, Kelly knew something was definitely wrong. This was not just brain fuzziness. So she pulled the car over, and she and her husband switched spots. And as she slumped into the passenger seat, Peter looked over at her with concern. He asked her if she knew what year it was, or who was the president of the United States. Kelly knew this was a standard way to check someone's cognitive abilities, and she felt a pang of terror as she realized she didn't know the answers to either of Peter's questions. All of a sudden, Kelly could barely focus at all. She felt like her brain was being flicked on and off like a light switch. And then, her mind went completely blank. Suddenly, Kelly opened her eyes back up. She realized she was lying down in her kitchen. She had no idea how she'd gotten there. She looked over and saw Peter crouched next to her, and then she also realized she was surrounded by paramedics. Peter told her she'd been acting strange the entire way home, and when they went to put their groceries away about 15 minutes ago, Kelly had just collapsed, and so Peter had called 911. Kelly nodded, confused, and then just tried not to move while the paramedics checked her vitals. Also, one of them pricked her finger to test her blood sugar levels, and after checking, he told her that her blood sugar was very low, a condition called hypoglycemia that can cause confusion and dizziness. Kelly asked if they were going to take her to the hospital now, but one of the paramedics just shook his head. He said that she should be fine as soon as she got her blood sugar elevated again. So he helped her sit up and then handed her a little package of jelly beans to eat. After a few minutes of eating them, Kelly was feeling better. Before the paramedics left, they told her to always keep some fast-acting carbohydrates like juice or candy on hand for whenever she felt lightheaded or woozy. Even though Kelly was still totally shocked by what had just happened to her, she was grateful to know what was actually wrong with her. This was hypoglycemia. However, she had to figure out why she became hypoglycemic. A few days later, Kelly sat across from her doctor, hoping for a plan or some sort of medicine to keep these episodes from happening to her again. Aside from these episodes being terrifying, she also just couldn't afford for people to think she was drunk all the time. The doctor explained that most likely, her body was making too much insulin, the hormone that regulates the amount of sugar flowing to the cells, especially the brain. Insulin is very important, but too much of it can pull too much sugar out of her bloodstream, robbing cells of their fuel. And so her brain didn't have the energy it needed to help her remember things or talk, and she didn't have the strength to stand up. That's why she was passing out in the middle of the day like she was drunk. But when the doctor looked over her most recent blood test, he was surprised. He told her that her insulin levels were slightly elevated, as if she had just eaten, even though she hadn't. But he told her to just keep an eye on it and keep an emergency stash of jelly beans on hand, just in case her blood sugar plummeted again. More than a year later, Kelly's husband, Peter, paced around his office with his phone to his ear. He was trying to reach Kelly at work, but she wasn't answering her office line. He had left her 4 messages in the past hour, and he was getting worried because she hadn't called him back. He sighed in frustration as his call went to voicemail again, and he left message number 5. Over the past 12 months, Peter had helped Kelly manage her low blood sugar. He stocked the fridge with juice boxes and made sure there were always packs of her favorite candy in her purse. He knew his wife was not happy with the 25 extra pounds she had gained from all the extra sugar, so he made sure they always went for a walk together before work. Peter knew Kelly was doing her best to keep her struggles from her colleagues, and for a while, it had worked. She didn't have any more of those low blood sugar moments when her colleagues thought she was drunk. But lately, Peter had noticed her low blood sugar moments were getting more frequent, and Kelly had to eat more and more sweets to snap out of them. And so that's why he had gotten into the habit of calling her at work every afternoon to check in on her. After still not hearing back from his wife, Peter decided to call the front desk at Kelly's office and ask the receptionist to check on Kelly. The receptionist said she could actually see Kelly right now sitting at her desk, and from the looks of it, It seemed like Kelly was sort of talking to herself. Peter's stomach immediately sank because this sounded like the start of an episode. But the receptionist told him there was a bottle of apple juice on Kelly's desk, and at that, Peter brightened. It sounded like his wife had the situation in hand. As long as she drank the juice, she would be fine. He thanked the receptionist and hung up, feeling a bit relieved, but still wanting to talk to Kelly that night to make sure she really was okay. But when Peter got home that night, he found Kelly stumbling around their kitchen, slurring her words. And so immediately Peter jumped into action. He held a glass of orange juice to her lips, and after a moment, she kind of came back to herself. And once she had recovered, he insisted this had gone on long enough. They both agreed Kelly needed to see a specialist. A week later, Dr. Frank Miller listened as Kelly described her embarrassing episodes and the constant suspicion that she was drunk at work. Dr. Miller was an endocrinologist, which is a doctor who specializes in hormone disorders. Dr. Miller swiveled his chair to the computer screen to take a look at her blood work, and he saw that her blood contained an amount of insulin that was normal for someone who had just eaten. However, Kelly had taken the test on an empty stomach. Dr. Miller double-checked with Kelly, and she insisted that really, she hadn't eaten anything and only had sips of water for the 12 hours before she took this blood test. Dr. Miller looked at the results again. Kelly's pancreas, the organ that makes insulin, was busily doing its job, even though there was no sugar in her body to process. Dr. Miller thought he might know what was wrong with Kelly. He explained that he wanted to run one more test to confirm his suspicions. But this test would involve more than just another vial of blood. The test was called an endoscopic ultrasound. He explained that he would guide a long, flexible tube fitted with a special instrument down her mouth and into her digestive system. He would wind it through her body until it landed near her pancreas. Then he would take a good look and tell her what he found. By the look on Kelly's face, Dr. Miller knew the thought of him snaking a tube through her insides made her uncomfortable. But he assured her she would get through the procedure just fine. And she would. When she awoke from the procedure, Dr. Miller was happy to report that he'd located the reason for her last few years of misery. The endoscopic ultrasound showed a blob the size of a pencil eraser on Kelly's pancreas. This blob was a benign tumor called an insulinoma, which was made of cells that produce insulin. Normally, the body tightly controls how much insulin the pancreas makes, but the cells in this tumor pumped out insulin constantly, whether the body needed it or not. And so all that extra insulin kept her blood sugar low no matter how much sugar she consumed. In 2013, the tumor was successfully removed. Kelly's life went back to normal. She stopped needing to eat so many sweets, she was able to lose the extra weight she had put on, and the rumors of her day drinking were finally put to rest. Fred Jablin watched with pride as his 3 children filed ahead of him into Temple Beth Ahaba's Friday evening service. The night, October 29, 2004, was cloudy and cool, and in Richmond, the capital city of Virginia, the maples and oak trees were still decked out with red and gold fall foliage. Even in the twilight darkness, the autumn colors glowed around the synagogue, the oldest Jewish house of worship in the city of almost 200,000 residents. Just the sight of Beth Ahaba and the graceful columns that fronted the stone and brick building always made Fred feel better, a little less anxious and a little less worried. And every time he walked past the familiar plaque outside the temple and read the words, quote, "What doth the Lord require of thee? Justice, mercy, humility," Fred reminded himself that those 3 qualities had already helped him get through the worst years of his life. And he believed now that those same 3 qualities, justice, mercy, humility, would help guide him and his son and 2 daughters into a happier future. As the Jablins took their usual seats and exchanged quiet greetings with friends and acquaintances, Fred did what he always did. He made a point of reflecting on just how important religion, community, friendship, and the support of his colleagues at work were to his life and his family. And the power of gratitude was just one of the very hard lessons Fred had learned during the last 5 years, when the cracks in his marriage of almost 2 decades had become too deep to patch up. As a well-known and highly regarded college professor who had been one of the early pioneers in the field of organizational communication, Fred had truly believed 5 years ago, back in 1999, that he and his ex-wife, Piper Roundtree, could work together to resolve their differences. But that was before he had found out about his wife's affair with a local doctor. And while that affair was the tipping point for Fred's decision to file for divorce the next year, in March of 2001, that affair had really just been the final betrayal in a series of events that still had the power to shock him, even now, 2 years after he and Piper had officially ended their marriage. As Fred settled into his seat and prepared for the Shabbat, the service that would celebrate God's creation of the world and mark the beginning of a 24-hour period of rest and reflection, he thought how close he had come to losing his job and to losing the trust and respect of his neighbors and coworkers. In the terrible lead-up to the divorce, Piper's behavior had become more and more erratic. The medications she was taking for depression and attention deficit disorder did not seem to be enough to stabilize her moods or decrease her sense of anxiety or discontent. But it wasn't until Piper began calling police and reporting that Fred was physically abusing her and accusing him of trying to drug her that Fred had finally understood just how broken their relationship really was. By then, they had already tried marriage counseling, and Piper had moved out of their family house several times to stay with her best friend in Richmond. But even then, somehow Piper and Fred had still managed to limp along, despite the difficulty Piper had in holding a job, despite the fact that she had a law degree, and her increasing unreliability in caring for the kids, even after she chose to stay at home rather than work outside of the house. But then came the afternoon 4 years ago when police arrived at the University of Richmond, where Fred had a tenured teaching position. Earlier that day, Piper had gone to the Henrico County Magistrate's office and sworn out an arrest warrant and restraining order against her husband. Of course, it hadn't always been that way. Back when Fred, an up-and-coming professor, and Piper, a student in her final year, met back in 1981 at the University of Texas in Austin, they seemed to have exactly nothing in common. And when Fred, who was 8 years older than Piper, first met Piper through another professor, Fred did not even recognize her as one of the many students who had attended one of Fred's classes the year before. While 21-year-old Piper was one of 5 children from an old Texas family that had lived in Harlingen, a small town just 30 miles north of the Mexico border, 29-year-old Fred was one of 2 brothers who were born and raised in a mostly Jewish working-class neighborhood just 20 miles east of New York City. While Piper was hands down beautiful, with her dark hair and dark eyes and petite but athletic build, Fred was thin and balding and completely average looking, except for the intelligent eyes and the playful grin that clued people in to his wry and entertaining sense of humor. And their outlook on the world turned out to be just as different as their appearances. Fred was a great believer in rational thinking, and where he viewed the world in terms of black and white and took great comfort in set routines, Piper was a free spirit who loved to paint and who would, over time, fill the couple's house with adopted and rescued animals, from birds to a pet ferret. But 2 years after their first meeting, Fred and Piper were married, and over the next 6 years, Piper would eventually get her law degree, cycle in and out of 2 jobs, and then give birth to their oldest child, their daughter Jocelyn. Their son Paxton would arrive 3 years later, and their youngest, Callie, would arrive 3 years after that. And for a long time, it seemed like Fred and Piper's differences actually brought out the best in each of them. Fred became less rigid in his thinking, and Piper seemed to blossom in the light of Fred's affection and devotion to her and the children. But over time, the charm of their opposite personalities seemed to wear very thin. Fred was never a big fan of Piper's family and took to skipping Piper's family reunions. For her part, Piper didn't really connect with Fred's family either, and when his parents died, she opted not to go to either of their funerals. But when Fred got the job offer from the University of Richmond, which came with a $30,000 a year bump in pay, both Piper and Fred agreed that, financially at least, the move from Texas to Virginia made all kinds of sense for their family. The extra money meant that Piper did not have to worry about working if she didn't want to, and she could hire a cleaning service to take care of the house, along with a nanny who could help with the kids. And at first, Fred was sure that the move had given all of them a fresh start. But by 1995, 12 years after they had gotten married, and just 1 year after their move from Texas to Virginia, Fred and Piper were seeing a marriage counselor. Piper was just not able to pass the Virginia bar exam. That's the test that would have allowed her to practice law in Virginia. And even though she had been reluctant to leave her close-knit family in Texas, Piper was not prepared for just how much she missed her mother and siblings. Particularly her older sister Tina, who had always been available to help babysit the kids and to take Piper's side in any of the complaints Piper had about Fred. Prone to postpartum depression, the arrival of the Roundtree-Jablin's third baby a year after the move to Virginia seemed to send Piper into a tailspin. But even therapy, both marriage counseling and private therapy with a psychiatrist, did not stop Piper from racking up nearly $52,000 in credit card debt any more than it would reverse the couple's slide into divorce a few years later. But still, nothing in those rocky years could have prepared Fred for that afternoon when Piper had orchestrated his arrest on that charge of domestic violence. Even now, sitting inside the place of worship he had returned to after the divorce, Fred could feel the shame and stunned surprise he felt as he left his office under police escort, hearing the whispers of students and seeing the shock on the faces of his colleagues. But maybe that was exactly what Fred had needed in order to accept that he and his children were probably better off without Piper. So, immediately after being released from the police station that day, Fred had obeyed the terms of the restraining order and kept his distance from Piper by moving into a motel not far from Richmond University, but he also wasted no time in hiring an attorney, and 1 month later, Fred appeared in juvenile court and argued successfully that the Roundtree-Jablin children were not safe with Piper. And when the judge examined the evidence of Piper's erratic behavior, the times when she had simply forgotten to pick the children up from school or other activities, and the complete lack of evidence that Piper was a victim of domestic violence, the judge granted Fred temporary custody of Jocelyn, Paxton, and Callie. Until that moment, Fred had believed that the love he and Piper shared for their 3 kids might be enough of a foundation for them to have a civil divorce. Instead, the children became the battlefield for a bitter custody fight. In the end, the court had not believed any of Piper's charges of abuse, and when Fred had filed for divorce, he did so on the grounds that Piper had been unfaithful. He had cited Piper's affair with their oldest daughter's doctor, although it would turn out that there had been other men too, maybe even going back to the mid-1990s. And there was nothing quick or easy about how they reached a settlement. Piper had repeatedly asked for delays in the divorce proceedings until finally, in 2002, almost a year to the date after Fred had filed for the divorce, when Piper did not show up for a hearing on finances and custody, the judge went ahead and made a final ruling without her. And that ruling would turn out to be absolutely devastating for the one-time stay-at-home mom, because on all fronts, Piper would wind up losing. According to that judgment, Fred, whose money had been used to purchase their house in Texas and their house in Virginia, and whose retirement account was much larger than Piper's, would get nearly all the couple's property and liquid assets. But it was the judgment on custody that would completely sever the bond between the parents, because when Fred would eventually press for full legal and physical custody, the court sided with him. That meant that Piper would need to go through Fred to make any and all arrangements to visit their 3 kids. And as far as support payments went, citing Piper's potential as an attorney to out-earn Fred's own salary as a professor, the court also agreed that Fred no longer needed to pay Piper support money, and that going forward, it was Piper who would need to get a job and pay Fred $890 in child support every month. Fred had had no illusions that Piper would actually make those payments, at least not on a monthly basis. And he was right. Piper had tried twice to declare bankruptcy as a way of setting aside the whole divorce decree until a federal bankruptcy court actually prevented her from filing a 3rd time. But Piper's new financial obligations did mean that in order to practice law, she would need to move 1,200 miles away back to Texas, where she had passed that state's bar exam and could practice law. But even though Piper had been the loser in the battle over custody, she had found ways to strike back at Fred. And when it came to revenge, Piper had a lot of help from her sister Tina. And just thinking of Tina made Fred's body tense. Immediately following the court ruling on child support and custody, Tina had written a 43-page so-called psychological profile of Fred. A nurse practitioner who ran her own women's healthcare clinic, Tina was not a licensed mental health professional. But that did not stop her from attacking every aspect of Fred's character, personality, and temperament. In the report, Tina accused Fred of physical and sexual assault, drug abuse, and various personality disorders. She also warned parents that any child or minor that Fred had contact with was at risk of being psychologically abused. Describing the report as a, quote, court document, so it sounded very official, Piper then emailed her sister's denunciation of Fred to his coworkers and university administration, as well as to members of the Parent-Teachers Association at the schools the children all went to, and to the leaders of the scout clubs the kids attended, and to the list of friends and acquaintances Fred and Piper had once shared. During that especially dark period, when the divorce and the pain was so raw that Fred questioned if life could ever seem normal again, he had wondered who hated him more, his ex-wife Piper or his ex-sister-in-law Tina. Just the thought of that question made Fred doubly relieved that he had changed his will just this last year so that in the event of his death, custody of his kids, along with the control over the financial assets his kids would inherit, would go to his brother, Michael, who lived with his wife and their 2 kids in Northern Virginia. Fred had also installed a home security system just in case. He'd never forgotten the time when Piper had taken their youngest child and disappeared without telling Fred, only to turn up in Texas at her sister Tina's with a story of how Fred had started trying to drug Piper. In fact, it had been the other way around. After Fred and Piper split, Fred had learned from a neighbor that Piper had confessed to spiking Fred's morning coffee with the antidepressant Prozac. Fred was suddenly brought back to the present by a gentle nudge from his 15-year-old daughter, Jocelyn, and he realized with a start that he had spent the last several minutes just going through the motions of the Friday evening service. He thought again of the plaque outside the temple, that what the Lord asked of him was justice, mercy, and humility. Fred was self-aware enough to know that when he and Piper divorced 2 years ago, he was thinking more of justice than he was of mercy or humility. But now, 2 years after the divorce agreement was signed, it seemed like both he and Piper had reached a much better place, both as a divorced couple and as individuals. It had taken Fred a while, but he had grown into his all-consuming role as single dad, and all 3 kids were doing exceptionally well. He loved taking the kids to their after-school and summer activities. They had become close to their uncle, Fred's brother Michael, and just 5 months earlier, Fred had ventured out into the dating world and had begun a promising relationship with another single parent, a down-to-earth woman named Charlene. As for Piper, she had begun dating soon after returning to Texas, where she now lived in Houston, very close to her sister Tina. Piper had her own small law practice, but made most of her income doing research into land titles. It was steady work that did not require a law degree, and it paid well enough that she had been able to afford a house of her own, a new black Liberty Jeep, and a lifestyle that seemed comfortable and secure. Even though Piper was often behind on child support, Fred was accommodating about any plans Piper could make to see their kids. In fact, just a few weeks earlier, Piper had come east and taken all 3 kids on a long weekend camping trip in one of Virginia's beautiful national forests. And even though her in-person visits with the kids were not as long or as many as Piper wanted, it wasn't unusual for her to call the kids more than once a day. Maybe, Fred thought as he gave Jocelyn a nudge back to show her he was paying attention again, maybe he and Piper both were ready to practice mercy and humility. Back at the Jablin house on Hearthglow Lane, Fred pulled into the driveway of the detached 2-car garage. A moment later, the children piled out of the Ford Explorer and made their way inside the handsome brick and wood 2-story house set on a slight rise and surrounded by stately trees. Halloween had always been Fred's favorite holiday, and he and the kids had bagged up most of the fallen leaves and stuffed them into leaf bags that were the shape and color of carved orange pumpkins. Throughout the quiet and affluent subdivision, with its neat green and white welcome sign that read Kingsley, homemade scarecrows and ghosts made out of white sheets watched over the comfortable homes, all set back from the road, some with living rooms and kitchen lights shining through the windows. Once inside 1515 Hearthglow Lane, Fred wasted no time shepherding the 3 children off to bed. It was around 10 p.m. when he had said his final goodnight and headed back downstairs to clean up and give Charlene a call before heading to bed himself. By the time Fred had switched off his bedside light and settled down to sleep, the painful memories of the past had been replaced with a sense of pleasant anticipation for the weekend ahead. Tomorrow was Saturday, and while the children slept in, Fred would enjoy his coffee and newspaper, and after that, all 4 of them would have a busy day, going to the annual neighborhood pumpkin festival, spending time together and with friends, and putting the finishing touches on their costumes. And on Sunday, they would all enjoy the kind of safe scares that came with going door to door trick-or-treating. At 6:37 a.m. the next morning, Fred Jablin's next-door neighbors awoke from a deep sleep to the sudden sound of 3 gunshots. Getting out of bed and stepping to the open window, former Marine Bob McCardle pushed aside the curtain and saw a shadowy figure running across his front yard and then disappearing into neighboring house lots. While dogs began barking and other neighbors were wondering if a car had backfired or if a hunter was shooting ducks down on Tuckahoe Creek, Bob immediately picked up the phone and called 911. Within minutes of the call, 3 officers from Henrico County Police Department were climbing out of the patrol car in front of the McCardle home. Spreading out across the lawns of Hearthglow Lane, they used flashlights to search in the darkness for the source of the disturbance. But after 20 minutes, the officers reported back to Bob that they had not found anything suspicious. Bob told them that once it was light, he and his wife would take their dog out for a walk, and if they saw anything that could explain the shots, they would follow up with another call to police. 25 minutes later, it was Doreen McCardle who called 911. Trying her best to keep the panic out of her voice, she explained to dispatch that she, her husband Bob, and their dog were now standing outside of their neighbor's house at 1515 Hearthglow Lane, and Bob had just discovered the body of Fred Jablin. The single dad and prominent Richmond University professor was lying in his driveway alongside the family car, his body stretched out on a thin carpet of blood-soaked leaves. This time, Henrico police responded with a flood of emergency and medical personnel, and within minutes, the quiet neighborhood was alive with flashing lights and sirens. But their response was too late. Fred Jablin was dead. Even as officers strung yellow crime scene tape around the half-acre lot of the Jablin home, a SWAT team had entered the house to make sure the murderer was not inside, and if necessary to rescue the 3 sleeping children. But the house was empty except for Fred's kids. As Jocelyn was escorted out the back door so she would not see her father's body lying in the driveway, the 15-year-old turned to the police officer at her side, and she asked him to please make sure her brother, sister, and father got out. By 8:30 a.m. that Saturday morning, Henrico County homicide investigator Kobe Kelly had arrived on the scene and pushed the investigation into high gear. A 4-year veteran of the police force, the 6-foot 2-inch tall detective was just 32 years old, but he had a well-deserved reputation for professionalism and for getting results. The Roundtree Jablin children were quickly sheltered at the home of a local police officer who knew the Jablins and lived in the same area. A special victims unit was on its way to help break the terrible news of their father's death and to find out what the children may have heard or seen that morning. Detective Kelly's initial examination of both the outside crime scene and the inside of the house showed no evidence that this had been a robbery gone wrong. There was no sign that anything had been taken. And unfortunately, the neighbor who had made the 911 call to police after hearing gunshots and seeing a figure run across his front lawn could not even identify whether that person had been a man or a woman. Hopefully, the crime scene techs, who were already there collecting any physical evidence and dusting for fingerprints, would be able to provide more information. But at first glance, it looked to Kelly like this had been a premeditated crime, planned by someone who must have known Fred Jablin's morning routine well enough to be lying in wait for him when he stepped outside in the dark that morning to pick up the newspaper that had been tossed onto his driveway. But even before Kelly heard back from the officers he'd sent out to knock on doors and collect information and search for the murder weapon, Kelly knew that there would be plenty of suspects in this case. The victim had been a high-profile college professor with a reputation for working closely with students, any one of whom might have harbored a grudge related to perhaps a failed thesis or maybe a bad grade. With that in mind, Detective Kelly also sent a team out to the University of Richmond, 6 miles east, to treat Fred's personal office as a crime scene and to interview faculty and students. The detective also started the process of obtaining search warrants, putting in a subpoena for any relevant phone records. But even as the investigator watched a crime scene tech carefully bag a copper-jacketed hollow-point bullet they'd found to the right of the body, Detective Kelly already had the name of the person he was most interested in talking to. In any homicide investigation, the most likely suspects are those with the closest and most intense relationships to the victim. And even though Fred Jablin's ex-wife, Piper Roundtree, lived 1,200 miles to the west in Houston, Texas, she was still number one on Detective Kelly's suspect list, especially when he heard from the first officers on the scene that Fred and Piper had gone through a very messy divorce just 2 years earlier, and that custody of the 3 kids was still an ongoing issue. By 10 a.m. that morning, the oldest of the Roundtree-Jablin children had told police that she had heard a gunshot early that morning but had gone back to sleep. The younger 2 kids both told police that they had each had separate phone conversations with their mom the afternoon and evening before. She told them she was calling from Galveston, Texas, where she was researching a land title. She'd also told 12-year-old Paxton about a raccoon that was living under the porch of her house. Knowing that the first 48 hours of any investigation are often the most crucial, Detective Kelly was determined to check out every possible lead. And even though Piper had told her children she had called last night from Texas, Detective Kelly still ordered investigators to check for any passengers named Piper Roundtree who may have flown into Richmond from Houston, Texas over the last several days. By 2:30 p.m., Michael Jablin had been informed of his brother's death, and he and his wife were in their car traveling south to Richmond. And by 3:30 p.m., just 8 hours after the McCardles had discovered Fred's body and made their second 911 call, Detective Kelly had already caught a major break in the investigation. His investigators had in fact discovered that a passenger by the name of Roundtree had flown out of Virginia's Norfolk Airport just 3 hours earlier on a Southwest Airlines flight that was due to arrive back in Houston's Hobby Airport at 4:30 Houston time, which meant 5:30 Virginia time. But there was one problem. The passenger's first name was not Piper. Instead, it was a name Detective Kelly had not yet heard: Tina. Detective Kelly had already found a good picture of Piper Roundtree in one of her children's bedrooms, and the driver's license picture on file for the plane ticket his investigators had discovered was definitely a different person. Instead of dark brown hair, Tina Roundtree had shoulder-length blonde hair. Glancing at his watch and seeing he had 2 hours before the plane carrying Tina Roundtree was due to arrive at Hobby Airport in Houston, Detective Kelly rolled into action. Contacting police in Houston, he sent them pictures of both Piper and Tina Roundtree and asked them if they would go to Hobby Airport in time to locate a passenger getting off that Southwest Airlines flight who looked like either of the 2 women. But it would turn out that Detective Kelly was now in for a series of disappointments. Whoever that passenger named Tina Roundtree was, she had managed to disembark, collect her checked bags, and apparently leave the airport in Houston without being intercepted or recognized by Houston police. And when Officer Kelly finally reached Piper Roundtree by phone in Houston that night at 9 p.m., 14 hours after Fred had been declared dead, it would turn out that Piper Roundtree would have a rock-solid alibi for the time of the murder. And after being informed by a friend in Richmond about Fred's murder that morning, the only thing Piper wanted to talk about now was where her children were, who was taking care of them, and how they were coping with this devastating news. By now, Detective Kelly had also been filled in on the identity of Tina Roundtree, Piper's older sister, who also lived in Houston. Realizing that he would need to conduct this investigation in 2 different states, Detective Kelly and his partner headed to Houston to interview the Roundtree sisters. Before leaving, the lead investigator assigned Detective Chuck Hanna and one other investigator to follow up on leads in Richmond. At Detective Kelly's first official interview with Piper on Sunday, October 31st, Fred's ex-wife denied any involvement in Fred's murder. And not only would a friend of hers, who was also a lawyer, place Piper in his office before that Southwest flight ever arrived back in Houston on Saturday, October 30th, the day Fred was killed, Piper would also be able to locate someone who could provide further confirmation of her alibi, a stranger who had seen her at a local bar in Houston on Friday night, when the passenger flying under the name Tina Roundtree had already landed 1,200 miles away in Richmond, Virginia. As for Piper's sister, Tina Roundtree, where Piper had reacted to the news of Fred's death by wanting to talk about when she could see her kids again, Tina had reacted to the news by being aggressive in her criticism of Fred. She held nothing back when it came to listing his faults as a father, a husband, and a human being. But even though the hatred Tina expressed was strong enough to constitute a possible motive for Fred's murder, Tina, who had been seen at her health clinic over the weekend, also had an alibi for the Friday night before Fred's murder and the Saturday morning when he was found dead by his neighbors. And both sisters pointed to alternative suspects that were much closer to 1515 Hearthglow Lane than Texas was. First on that list was Michael Jablin, the brother who stood to gain control of Fred's financial assets. And what about Fred's latest love interest? Had police interviewed Charlene yet? And finally, without providing any names, Piper also hinted darkly at enemies Fred had within the University of Richmond. And when Virginia investigators dug deeper into the money trail behind the passenger tickets belonging to the still unidentified person who traveled under the name Tina Roundtree, the case only got more confusing. The airplane tickets had been purchased by Piper's former boyfriend on a credit card he said he hadn't used in weeks and had assumed was lost. And when investigators in Richmond found a reservation under the name Tina Roundtree at a motel in Richmond for the night before Fred's murder, the name of the person who actually checked into that room showed up in the motel records as Geraldine Smith. And drifting in the background behind the Roundtree sisters, there was Tina's on-again, off-again boyfriend who had recently taken Piper off to a shooting range for some target practice. Meanwhile, both Piper and her sister Tina started ducking out on any more interviews with law enforcement. Instead, the two sisters checked into the expensive and stylish Houstonian Hotel in central Houston. The only thing Piper seemed to care about now was arranging a court hearing in Virginia to get custody of her 3 kids. And Tina, who had appointed herself as Piper's guardian and champion, was there to support Piper and keep the press and police at bay. So despite a promising start, 3 days after the Virginia police had arrived in Houston, Texas, progress into Fred Jablin's murder came to a stuttering halt. And even though detectives in Richmond had turned up some promising evidence, what police needed was someone who could positively identify the airline passenger who went by the name Tina Roundtree and then place that person in Richmond at the time of Fred's murder. And on Wednesday, November 3rd, 5 days after Fred Jablin was killed, police finally got the tip they needed to break the case. Based on an interview with a Southwest Airlines ticketing agent and the deconstruction of hundreds of cell phone calls placed during the days before and after Fred Jablin's death, here is a reconstruction of what happened outside of 1515 Hearthglow Lane on the morning of Saturday, October 30th, 2004. Anyone who knew Frederick Mark Jablin also knew he was a man who enjoyed his routines, especially after all the disruptions of the last 2 years. He found new meaning in simple pleasures, like getting up at the same time every morning, retrieving his newspaper from the side driveway, then enjoying a freshly brewed pot of coffee in his quiet kitchen. And on this Saturday, when Fred stepped outside dressed in his navy blue sweatpants, sweatshirt, and robe, he also enjoyed knowing that he and the kids could spend the day together, getting ready for Halloween. When he and Piper were together, it had been Fred who took the family pictures, even though it meant that he himself was rarely in any of them. This year, he would make sure to have his neighbors take pictures of him and the 3 kids. It had been a long haul getting through the divorce, but despite the painful memories that had preoccupied him last night during the Friday evening service at Temple Beth Ahaba, the fact was that Fred felt pretty good about his life and about his kids. He and Piper might not see eye to eye, and Fred doubted he'd ever fully trust his ex-wife again, but he knew she loved their kids as deeply as he did. As Fred headed slowly for the driveway, he could see the tall trees that ringed the big backyard and feel the chill air on his face and ankles. This time tomorrow, daylight savings time would come to an end and clocks would have been set back an hour. Instead of darkness, he'd be watching the sun rise. Still, he liked this feeling of being all alone, the only person awake and outside. Except that Fred was not alone. Standing quietly in the shadow on the far side of the garage, Fred's killer had felt their pulse quicken at the sound of the back door opening and then closing softly behind Fred. Now, the killer heard the slight rustle of leaves as Fred turned right out of the back kitchen door and began walking towards the open space between the house and the garage, which was set back even farther from the street than the house was. The newspaper lay neatly folded on the far side of the black Ford Explorer that was parked near the top of the driveway. The killer knew Fred would walk between the garage doors and around the front bumper of the vehicle to retrieve the paper, and when Fred did exactly that, the killer would be ready. Now adjusting their blue latex gloves, the killer took a slow, deliberate breath. The killer assumed the children were asleep in the house, but even if they were awake, or if they woke up, and even came down the stairs or looked out the bedroom windows, they wouldn't see anything. The killer would be gone, and Fred's body would be hidden from view by the big black car in the driveway. A moment later, the sound of rustling leaves gave way to the sound of slippers on pavement. But as Fred rounded the front bumper of his Ford Explorer, the garage doors on his left and the children's basketball hoop on the other side of the driveway facing him, he paused for a second before making another quarter turn to his right to scan the ground for the folded newspaper. At that moment, Fred's killer stepped out of their hiding place on the far side of the garage. This shot would not be fired at point-blank range, or even close enough to leave any gunpowder residue on Fred's sweatshirt or robe, but the killer would still hit their target. A moment later, as Fred straightened and began to turn back towards whatever he had just seen out of the corner of his eye, his killer pulled the trigger of the .38 caliber revolver loaded with its copper-jacketed hollow-point bullets. And as the sound of the shots died away, the killer watched as Fred crumpled to the ground. Reaching the pavement, Fred's body rolled so he lay face down but still partly on his side, his glasses landing a foot or so away from his face, his knees drawn up slightly towards his chest. Although neighbors would report hearing 3 gunshots, only 2 bullets hit their mark. The second shot entered the soft tissue of Fred's right arm back to front, the bullet traveling downward and missing any vital tissue. That was the bullet that would be recovered at the crime scene in just a few hours. It was the first shot that proved fatal. That type of bullet, designed to mushroom out upon impact so it did maximum internal damage, had entered from the back, striking Fred in the lower right side before ripping upward through his spleen, kidney, liver, diaphragm, and aorta, the main artery carrying blood away from the heart. By the time the first dogs in the neighborhood had started to bark, the killer was running across the neighbor's front lawn towards the darker shade of the trees that bordered each house lot. The medical examiner, who would later perform the autopsy on Fred's body, could not rule out the possibility that if Fred had been found immediately after that first 911 call at around 6:37 a.m., he might have survived his injuries. Still, the first medics on the scene an hour later had done everything they could. Despite not finding a pulse, they still turned Fred onto his back and cut away his shirt to inject heart-stimulating drugs and to perform CPR, but they were too late. Sometime between that first 911 call and the second 911 call more than an hour later, Fred had died of organ failure and massive internal bleeding. By the time police had covered Fred's body with a white sheet and escorted his terrified children out of the house, Fred's killer was already on the road, making the 2-hour drive south to Virginia's Norfolk International Airport. After returning their rented maroon minivan, Fred's killer made their way to the ticketing agent at Southwest Airlines. At 8:29 a.m., 2 hours after murdering Fred, the killer booked a flight first to Baltimore, 200 miles north, and then on from Baltimore to Houston, Texas. As Piper Roundtree handed the Southwest Airline ticketing agent her sister Tina's ID and the ticket Piper had bought using the credit card that she'd taken from her boyfriend, Jerry Walters, she made a quick adjustment to the blonde wig she was wearing over her dark brown hair, and she also made sure her sunglasses completely covered her brown eyes. A few minutes later, when Piper sat down in the waiting area until it was time to board her 12:30 a.m. flight back to Houston, she pulled out her cell phone and scrolled through the long list of calls she had made since arriving in Richmond 2 days earlier, on Thursday, October 28th. She was smart to have asked the receptionist at the motel in Richmond to change her name in the register from Tina Roundtree to Geraldine Smith, just one more way to throw police off her trail. And when the police did come to question her, she could honestly tell them that things with Fred were so much better now than they had been 2 years ago. But for Piper, her camping vacation earlier in the month with the kids had finally shown her that getting along better with Fred still wasn't enough. The person her children really needed wasn't their father, it was her, their mother. And soon enough, they would have her, and only her. As Piper tucked Tina's driver's license back inside her wallet, Piper looked closely at the small picture of her sister. Tina was a little taller and heavier, her hair was blonde and her eyes were a bright blue, but when Piper wore the wig and dark glasses, all people saw were the similarities in the sisters' faces and expressions and that wide Roundtree smile. But it would turn out that Piper's disguise, like her alibi, was not quite as good as she thought it was. 5 days after Piper Roundtree killed the father of her 3 kids, Detective Kelly from Virginia knew that in order to solve this murder investigation, he needed to get a positive ID on Southwest Airlines passenger Tina Roundtree. So, on the afternoon of Wednesday, November 3rd, the same day that hundreds of people were attending Fred Jablin's funeral service back in Richmond, the investigator made one more trip back to Hobby Airport in Houston. He tracked down the name of the Southwest Airline agent who had checked Tina Roundtree's ticket and luggage on her flight from Houston out to Richmond 1 week earlier on Thursday, October 28th. When he met Kathy Molly, the big detective from Virginia showed her Tina Roundtree's airline ticket and asked Kathy if she could remember anything about the passenger. A moment later, Kathy handed the ticket back with a friendly smile. "Yeah, I remember," she told the investigator. Kathy went on to say that the passenger was a very attractive woman, nicely dressed, but there was something else Kathy remembered too. The passenger was obviously wearing a blonde wig, and along with her suitcase, she was carrying a gun. And when Detective Kelly showed Kathy the pictures he now carried with him everywhere, one of Tina Roundtree and one of Piper Roundtree, Kathy didn't even hesitate before tapping the photo of Piper. "That's her," Kathy said. "That's the woman who checked the gun." On Monday, November 8th, 2004, 10 days after Fred was shot to death outside of his home on Hearthglow Lane, Henrico County Police charged his ex-wife, Piper Roundtree, with first-degree murder. Piper was arrested shortly after leaving a custody hearing in Virginia, at which Piper asked the court to grant her, and not Fred's brother Michael, custody of the 3 Roundtree Jablin children. In addition to having been identified as the passenger traveling to and from Richmond under the name Tina Roundtree, Piper's cell phone records had also placed her in and around Richmond from Thursday, October 28th through the morning of Saturday, October 30th, the morning of Fred's death. Even though Piper claimed that she and her sister Tina often used one another's cell phones, the phone that Piper used on Friday evening, the night before Fred was killed, to call her son Paxton and tell him she was in Texas, was the same cell phone that had pinged off cell phone towers in Richmond to connect that call to Paxton's cell phone. As for Piper's alibis, it would turn out that after checking credit card receipts, the man who had placed Piper in the Volcano Bar in Houston on that Friday night before Fred's murder had made a mistake. It had been Saturday night, after Piper had returned from Richmond, that she was seen at that bar. And although Piper's friend and former law colleague would insist to Virginia investigators that he had talked to Piper in Houston midday on Saturday, before that Southwest flight from Baltimore arrived in Houston, it turned out that he had made an earlier statement to a reporter saying that the first time he had seen Piper in nearly a year was the day after Fred's murder, Sunday, October 31st, when she would have already been back in Houston for nearly 24 hours. On Saturday, February 26, 2005, 1 year and 4 months after Fred was murdered, a Virginia jury spent less than 1 hour in deliberations before coming back with a guilty verdict in the trial of Piper Roundtree. Her defense attorney argued, unsuccessfully, that the real murderer was Piper's sister, Tina, and when Piper herself took the stand, she implied the same thing, while at the same time insisting to the end that she herself had absolutely nothing to do with Fred's murder. When asked point blank if she wanted the jury to think her sister Tina committed the murder, Piper replied, "I have no idea what happened." Piper would use that same refrain when she was asked how her cell phone had appeared in Virginia in the days before and on the day of Fred's murder, or why she decided to brush up on her shooting skills the week before Fred's death, or why she had used her boyfriend's credit card to purchase a blonde wig, or how her black Liberty Jeep had wound up in the parking lot at the Hobby Airport in Houston from Thursday, October 28th to Saturday, October 30th, Piper told the jury she either had no idea how those things could have happened, or that they were just meaningless coincidences that had nothing to do with Fred's murder. 2.5 months later, on May 7th, 2005, Piper was sentenced to life in prison. Her first request for parole in 2020 was denied. She will be eligible for parole again in 2033 when she will be 72 years old. On Friday, November 4th, 2005, days before Piper's trial for murder, Piper's sister, Tina, pled guilty in a Houston courtroom to a charge related to Fred Japlin's murder, attempted tampering of evidence. Tina was fined $300 and sentenced to 80 hours of community service. Tina died in 2020. In 2006, a Virginia court granted full custody of Fred and Piper's 3 children to Fred's brother, Michael Jablin. We'd like to say a special thanks to author Catherine Casey, whose book, Die, My Love, a true story of revenge, murder, and 2 Texas sisters, was our main source in creating this podcast. Because Piper Roundtree has never admitted any guilt or involvement in the murder of Fred Jablin, we relied on the prosecution's evidence and theory of motive to create our reconstruction of this crime. If you're interested in finding out more, please see our source list for additional background and information. Dispatchers hear a lot of interesting stories coming from the other end of the phone. But one group of dispatchers out of Reno, Nevada may win the award for the creepiest 911 calls ever received. When the details of these calls they got were put online, the internet went crazy. Here is their story. There was this old couple that lived about 20 miles east of Reno, Nevada. In 2010, the husband dies, leaving the wife all alone in this house. Shortly after his passing, she began calling 911 2-3 times a week, requesting things like, "Can you please put some water on to boil? Hey, can you change the thermostat?" It was clear she was showing signs of dementia, and the dispatchers were respectful of her and gently told her that this is 911, you can only call if it's an emergency, and at some point the woman would understand her mistake and she would say sorry and she would hang up. No first responders were ever sent out for these calls because it didn't seem like an emergency, it just seemed like a confused elderly person. But no matter how many times they told her, she kept calling back, and eventually her calls took a turn. Instead of calling 911 to ask for help with mundane tasks around the house, she would call 911 believing she was talking directly to her deceased husband, John. The dispatcher would pick up and the woman would say, "John, where are you? John, John." By this time, the dispatchers had gotten so many calls from this woman, they would recognize her address coming through, and they knew what to expect. They would answer the phone, they'd be respectful, and they would tell her, like they always did, "This is 911, you can't call here, you need to talk to your family." And again, they did not send a responding unit out to her because it just seemed like she was confused, not in any danger. But one day when she called, she sounded frantic and scared. "John, please come home, help me, I need help, John, come home." This time, they would send first responders out to the woman's house. When the responding unit arrives at her house just minutes after she had placed the 911 call, they go to the door and they're knocking and they're yelling for her and she's not coming to the door and it's all quiet in the house. The door is unlocked, so they open it up and they announce themselves. They walk inside and immediately they can tell the heat is not on because it's very, very cold inside the house. They look around the first floor and they can't find her, and there's no sign of a struggle or any obvious problems that could have happened inside of the house. So they go upstairs and they start searching all the rooms and no one's there until they get to the last room, and it's the bedroom. They go inside and there's an older woman who's lying on the bed, and she's clearly deceased and has been for several hours because rigor mortis had already set in. The police are able to confirm that the woman who's lying on the bed is the same woman who owns the house and lives there. And at this point, they call back to dispatch and they tell them, hey, the woman that you claim made this 911 call, well, it can't have been her. Because based on rigor mortis, she was dead at the time that 911 call was made. But the dispatchers are like, no way. We know what she sounds like. We speak to her multiple times a week. We have a whole protocol built when we see her address come across because we speak to her so often. That 911 call that you got that led you to that house where she was, that call was made by her. What they ultimately decide is the reason for this discrepancy is she didn't have rigor mortis. She was just stiff because it was really cold inside of her house, and that she had died in those couple of minutes between leaving the 911 call and when officers arrived. But in the back of everybody's minds, they're a little freaked out. A few days go by and another call is placed to 911 coming from that woman's home address. The dispatcher sees that and has to do a double take, like that's not possible. But they're thinking, okay, this could be a relative, it could be a friend, it could be anything. Picks up the phone and she's shocked when it's the same woman who is frantically yelling for John to come here, save me, help me, I need help. And the dispatcher, who's well aware of the history and well aware that this woman's supposed to be dead, stays calm, goes through the procedure, tries to get more information from this woman, but the call ends abruptly and there's no more information to be had. And so not knowing what else to do, she asks a responding unit to go check this house out. The responding unit goes over to the property, they knock on the door, no one's inside, the door is actually still open, they go in, the house is empty, there's no one there, there's no one that could have made that call. At this point, dispatch is like, okay, this has got to be a prank. But the next day, same thing happens. Here comes a call from the dead woman's house. They pick it up and it's this distraught woman yelling for help. I need my husband. And the dispatcher is trying to get more information, but they can't. And then the line cuts out. Once again, they have to send responders to this location because this woman has called 911 and is saying that she needs help. And once again, the officers get to the house and it's vacant. Just like when she was alive, these calls would persist multiple times a week. They continued even after her house was broken into and burned to the ground. There's not even a house anymore, and there are still calls coming through from that address to 911. Finally, the police get in touch with the phone company and they explain the situation, and the phone company looks at their records and they say, actually, her phone line was disconnected almost immediately after she was deceased. But they tell police there's a chance that it might not have been disconnected properly at the site, and that could be a reason why it's still working. So they send a lineman to go check out the actual property to confirm her lines were disconnected properly and that no wires were getting crossed, and he said all of it checked out. Everything has been detached this whole time. The phone company thought perhaps there was a digital recording of her that got trapped in their system and was randomly bouncing to their call center. But the dispatchers would say, it doesn't sound like a recording that's playing the same every single time. It's always the same message. She's yelling for her husband to come save her. But the way she sounds is always different. It's a unique phone call every single time. So because there wasn't a definitive explanation for why this was happening, they had to treat each call like it was serious. And so multiple times a week for a year, they received these ghost calls and had to send out responding officers to check on her, even though the house was gone and there was nothing there and there was never anyone there. It was just a vacant lot. And then finally, a year after this woman has died, the calls just abruptly stopped. And the police did not launch an investigation into what it was, because the reality is police need to prioritize things that are threats to people or places. And this really wasn't either of those things. It was just really bizarre. And so the official explanation for how a dead woman could be calling 911 from a non-existent phone line in a non-existent house for a year is, we don't know. Our next and final story is called The Capitol Theater Haunting. In 2006, Dave Murphy had just become a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. His first role was as a protective service officer, which meant he'd be in charge of physical security in a number of the county facilities. Dave's first facility was the Capital City Theater, which is a landmark inside of Salt Lake City. It's been around since the early 1900s. It's this beautiful, grand theater. So in early August, Dave reports to the Capital City Theater for his first day on the job, and he meets his partner, an officer by the name of Morgan Matthews. He gets there on this first day, and right away, Dave would say that Morgan was just strictly business. The first place that Morgan takes Dave is the control room, which sits on the first floor of the theater. The theater had 3 floors, and then it also had a basement as well. So the control room was on that first floor. Inside of the control room were all of the security monitors, because there was all these cameras set up inside of the theater. The cameras weren't great though. You pretty much could only tell what was in frame if there was a light on, and most of the time at night especially, lights were off. Once they were done looking at the control room, Morgan says to Dave, now we're going to go do our rounds. This is something we do every time you get to the theater. You do a security round and make sure everything's locked, all the lights are off. Before you come back to the control room, you'll do that at the beginning of your shift and at the end of your shift. Morgan brings Dave downstairs, and it's the first time Dave is seeing the basement, and he's shocked by how big it is. It is this massive hallway that stretches way down. In the middle of the hall is a piano that's just sitting out in the middle, and the lighting's not good down there. This is a very old theater. Everything in the building was pretty old. And Dave remembers thinking that he was immediately creeped out by this scene, this long hallway with all these doors and this piano right in the middle of the hallway. And he's thinking to himself, I don't want to spend much time down here. This is so creepy. But they go down the hall, they check all the doors, they make their way up to the main floor, the second floor, the third floor, everything gets checked. And so after they do this security round, Dave and Morgan go back to the control room, and Dave is anticipating getting to know Morgan a little bit. This is their first night, they're going to be working together a lot, and Dave would say that Morgan just seemed really cold and just did not want to talk to Dave very much. And as soon as their shift was almost over, Morgan was very eager to just knock out the security rounds and just get out of that building. At the end of that night, Dave remembers thinking that there's just something off about Morgan's behavior. It seemed like Morgan really didn't like being in the theater. And it would turn out that he was onto something, because Morgan didn't like being in that building. But it would take him a while to share with Dave why. Over the next couple of days, Morgan and Dave would do their security rounds together, because Dave's in training, Morgan's teaching him. But on August 9th, which is 2 days after Dave's first day on the job, Morgan was confident that Dave knew how to secure the whole building. And so at the end of the night, he tells Dave, why don't you do the security rounds yourself? Dave feels very confident that he knows how to do it. He goes down into the basement, makes sure all the doors are shut and locked, that the lights are off, finishes the basement, goes up to the first floor where the control room is and checks all the rooms on that floor. He goes into the main auditorium space. He's checking all the different nooks and crannies to make sure there's nobody hiding in there. He goes up to the second floor. He checks all the different rooms up there and the balcony, makes his way up to the third floor where there's all the offices of staff that work at the theater. At the end of the search, the last room he would check was the rehearsal room. And it was the only room where there was no door to it. So you'd poke your head in, kind of look around, make sure no one was in there, and then you would leave, and that's the end of your check. So Dave gets to the rehearsal room, he flips the light on, and he looks inside, doesn't see anybody, is satisfied that no one's in there, turns the light off, and as he's about to turn back into the hallway, he hears a door slam with tremendous force right across the hallway from where he was, and it was the bathroom door. And his first reaction is someone just ran out of the bathroom. Someone who had snuck into the building must have run out of the bathroom, and they're making a break for it to get out of the theater before I catch them. And so he instinctively picks up his radio and he calls to Morgan and says, someone's on the third floor. But when Morgan looks at the camera, he doesn't see anybody. At this point, Dave's drawn his weapon, and he's looking down the hall. He doesn't see anybody. And as he's waiting for Morgan to come upstairs to back him up so they can go look for this person that's just ran down the hall, he realizes 2 things. One, just because he heard the door slam doesn't mean they left and slammed it. They could be in the bathroom. And so he's thinking to himself, someone could be in the bathroom right now. Maybe that's why we didn't see him on the camera. And then the second thing he thought of is that door, the bathroom door, can't slam. It's got this huge hydraulic hinge to it. It can't slam. So his gun is drawn and he's aiming it at the bathroom door right as Morgan comes up on his right. Morgan draws his pistol. He's got it on the door as well. And they make entry into the bathroom. They clear all the different spaces in the bathroom and no one's in there. And there's no way to get out of there. Morgan and Dave are like, okay, well, they must not have come in here. They must have run out of the bathroom. They're somewhere in the theater. And so they decide they're going to search the entire building and find this person that clearly was just in the bathroom, and that's how they slammed the door. We're not going to worry about how they slammed the door with the hydraulic hinge. We just know it was slammed somehow. So they leave the bathroom, guns still drawn, and they start making their way down the hall. They're checking all the doors, everything is locked. When they start making their way downstairs to the second floor, Dave recognizes through the door, because there's a door leading onto the second floor, he can see that the lights are on, and he had turned them off. And so as they're walking down the stairs, he says to Morgan, "Hey, did you turn the lights on the second floor?" And Morgan's like, "No." And so they think that whoever was here, whoever was in the bathroom is on the second floor. They must have turned the lights on. They go into the second floor, and not only are the lights on, but all the doors on the second floor had been opened. They search the entire second floor. They search every single room. No one's on the second floor. They turn off the lights. They shut all the doors. Everything's locked. When they went down to the first floor, everything was the way it should have been. Locked, lights off, nothing down there. And they go down to the basement. And even though it was creepy being down there because they've now searched the whole building and they're anticipating coming in contact with whoever is here, assuming they haven't left the building yet. And there's no one down there. They decided to review the footage from the third floor to see if they could pick up someone running in the hall around the time that door slammed. But the camera was not trained on the bathroom door. So you just have this view down the hall. You can't see the bathroom specifically, not to mention the hallway is dark and the cameras are terrible without light. And so all they're able to see is the light go on in the rehearsal room while Dave is doing his last check in there. The lights turn off because Dave's about to turn around. And then after that, you just hear this massive slam of this door, but you can't see what happened. So they don't know what to make of it. They're both very much on edge that someone might still be in the building. And so they do another sweep of the building and no one's there. And so they decide to just chalk it up and say, "We were hearing things and seeing things. I'm sure it's fine. Let's just get out of here." And they leave. A couple of days later, on August 11th, Morgan is working alone. Dave wasn't coming in that day, so Morgan's alone in the theater doing a shift. And at some point in the night, as he's sitting in the control room, he thinks he hears whispering in the hall right behind him. And so after the experience he had with Dave a couple nights ago, he's on edge. So he draws his pistol right away. And so he goes out into the hallway, and immediately when he steps into the hall, the whispering seems to go farther and farther away from him down the hall. So he gets out there, he's looking around, he can't see anything. He makes his way down the hallway towards the stairs that go down into the basement, or if he wanted to go up to the second floor. And when he gets to the top of the stairwell, he's gun drawn, looking down, looking up. He hears what sounds like coughing coming from the basement. And at this point, Morgan said that he was actually pretty scared. I mean, imagine being alone in this theater. Just a couple of days earlier, you've had this weird experience with slamming doors and doors being opened and lights going on that somebody else, another police officer, witnessed with you. You're alone in this theater and you're hearing coughing coming from the basement after hearing voices behind you. That's pretty terrifying. So he very slowly starts going down the stairwell. He's getting ready to clear the corner, and just as he does, the coughing stops. He turns the lights on and he looks down the hall and there's nothing there. He starts making his way down the hall. He's checking every door, making sure it's locked, making sure that everything is secure. And he gets all the way down the hall. And as he's almost done checking the basement, he smells smoke and it's coming from a door right next to him. And so he unlocks that door and he goes in and there's no fire. But all he can smell is smoke. So he turns the light on. He's looking around. There's no fire. He's convinced that somewhere down in the basement there's a fire. He goes to every single room and he keeps checking and there's nothing. And then at some point the smoke smell dissipates. He checks every space in the theater to look for a fire and there's no fire. He's wondering if he should call the fire department, but he's thinking, what would I tell them? There's no fire. And so he ultimately, after checking 3-4 times and being very confident there wasn't a fire, he just says, okay, no fire. I guess I was just smelling things. A few weeks later, on September 4th, Dave has just arrived at the theater. He's there a little bit early. Their shift started at 5 p.m. He was there at about 4:30. And when he walked into the building, he sees that there are 3 staff members sitting at the front desk talking to each other. And as he walks past, one of them is talking about ghosts inside of the theater. And it immediately piques his interest. And so he walked over to the guy talking about ghosts and he introduced himself. And it turned out that this guy was a man named Blair Fuller, who was a senior accountant at the theater. And so Dave asked Blair, what are you talking about with ghosts in the theater? Because I provide physical security here and I've seen some strange things here. I just love to hear what you have to say about it. So they head up to the 3rd floor where Blair's office was and they sit down and Blair says, okay, I got a doozy for you. This happened to me a couple years ago. I was actually in this office. It was about 9, 10 o'clock at night. I was doing some work and I heard the elevator kick on.
Now, the elevator was right outside of his office, and anytime it was on, the engine was really loud. It was really obvious if the elevator was moving around. And so he's doing his accounting work and he hears that engine kick on. He doesn't think much of it, but then it clicks that he's the only one in the building. And so he kind of looks out the glass window of his office. He had a closed door office with 2 windows looking out into the foyer where there's this elevator. And he looks out and he can see that the little lights above the elevator showing what floor it's on have lit up and it's going up. So the elevator was in the basement and now it's on the 1st floor, the 2nd floor, 3rd floor. The door's open and there's no one there. And at this point, Blair says that he wasn't concerned. He figured, okay, maybe there's some maintenance, maybe it's scheduled to do that, who knows? But after a little while, the alarm goes off in the elevator to signify that something is obstructing the door from shutting. And he's like, there's nothing obstructing the door, why isn't it shutting? And so he leaves his office and he kind of walks over to the elevator and he walks into the elevator. And he said immediately he felt this massive drop in temperature inside of the elevator. And as he's standing there, he turns around. Now he's looking back towards his office inside of the elevator. The doors start to shut. And for whatever reason, he said, I didn't get off. I just decided I'm going to ride this elevator. The basement button lights up as if someone had pressed basement and they start going down. And he's sitting there thinking, what in the world is going on? It was just on an alarm because the door wasn't shutting. And then miraculously, when I go inside of it, it suddenly works again and it's going to the basement. So he goes to the basement, the door opens, no one there. He steps out and Blair says that it took all of his courage to yell out, hey, is anyone down here? And as soon as he did and he didn't hear a response, he said he didn't want to make any more sound. The elevator sat in the middle of the hall in the basement. It's that huge hall with that piano sitting right in the middle. The lights are off. And he pokes his head down one way. There's nothing down there. He sees the piano barely from the light of the elevator. And he looks down the other way. There's no one there. And at this point, he's just so spooked. He just gets back in the elevator and he hits floor 3, floor 3, floor 3. And he's hitting like door closed, door closed, door closed. The door closes and he goes back up to his office. He goes into his office and he shuts the door and he sits down and he's thinking like, what was that? Why did that just happen? I got to find out if they're running maintenance or something. And as he's sitting in his chair thinking about this strange experience, he hears what sounds like banging sounds coming from outside of his office in that foyer near the elevator. He just goes to his door and he opens it up and he pokes his head into the foyer and he looks to the side and there's this big filing cabinet and all of the cabinets are out. They've all been pulled out. He certainly didn't do this. And it was as if someone was one by one pushing each of them shut, these big heavy cabinets. And he's watching as one by one these things are slamming shut. One by one until the whole thing is shut. And so he goes over and he's like trying to disprove what he just saw, that he can open up a drawer and that it will shut on its own. But none of them shut on their own. You have to shut it. Something has to shut it for it to shut. And so he packed up for the day and left and did not work another night shift at the theater. Later that night, Dave would share Blair's story with Morgan. He wasn't really sure how Morgan was going to react, but Morgan actually would open up and he would say, before you started working here, I always felt like I was being watched when I was here. And then we had that experience, obviously, where the lights are coming on and you heard that banging from that bathroom door. And then just a few days ago, I heard voices coming from the hall and I heard someone coughing in the basement and I smelled smoke and there was no one there. And so they start going back and forth, exchanging stories of just how uncomfortable this place made them feel. And so they're wondering what they should do about this. And Dave has this idea. He's like, my best friend, I'll invite him to come over here one night and we'll tell him that we're giving him a tour of the building and we'll just see what he says. We'll see if he reacts to anything here. Who knows? Maybe something strange will happen and then we'll have another person validate it. Morgan thinks that's a good idea. And so Dave reaches out to his best friend, Greg. Greg would say that he was a little bit surprised to be getting this offer to come take a tour of the theater, but he was interested, and since Dave was asking, he figured he would oblige him, and so Greg agrees to come to the theater and take a tour. So the next day, Dave and Morgan are at the theater, and Greg shows up, and so they start this tour. They go in the main auditorium, they're looking around, and then they make their way into the basement. Morgan turns on the light. And Morgan and Dave instantly see a little ways down the hall on the left, one of the doors has been opened. And so Dave and Morgan push Greg out of the way. They draw their pistols and they're aimed at the open door. And so Greg just stays behind them as Morgan and Dave make their way down to this open door. And when they get right outside the door and they're about to push it open to go inside, the door slams shut right in front of Greg and Dave and Morgan. And they all are looking at each other like, what's going on? but before they can do anything, the door handle starts rattling really aggressively. After the rattling stops, Dave and Morgan look at each other and they nod their head like, we gotta go in there. Greg is scared about being out in the hall alone, and so he just follows them in. And so the three of them go into this room. Dave and Morgan are, pistols drawn. It's a small room. There's no one in there. Light switch on, no one in there. Greg suddenly gasps and he points to the corner and he says, someone's sitting in the corner. And Dave and Morgan immediately train their guns on what's in the corner, but no one's there. And Greg's like, I just saw someone sitting in the corner. It looked like he had a hood on, he had like a sweatshirt on, I don't know, but he was right there. And so Dave and Morgan, they're freaked out because they brought Greg here on some level to disprove the strangeness. And now the three of them have seen a door slam that shouldn't have been open in the first place. Greg's claiming to have seen a figure sitting in the corner. This scared the crap out of all three of them. They quickly left, locked, shut off the lights, went upstairs. Greg's like, I'm out of here. Greg leaves. And Dave and Morgan are like, now what? So at this point, all the strangeness that was happening in the theater was getting reported, but it was being reported in a way that Dave and Morgan didn't seem like they were referencing something haunted, but rather someone was breaking in. Ultimately, the county installed new cameras inside of the theater. These updated cameras had infrared technology, which allowed them to see better when the lights were off. They were hoping that this would allow them to catch whoever was breaking in practically every time Dave and Morgan are on shift. So on the day that it was installed, September 15th, Morgan is working there alone. And he's sitting in the control room looking at the different cameras, and he's kind of playing around with the different screens and seeing what each of the cameras can do. And at some point, something catches his eye in one of the screens. In the main auditorium, it appeared like someone might be sitting in one of the seats, but the camera was zoomed back enough that he couldn't get a clear picture, and he didn't know what was normal in any of these cameras, because this is the first time he's looking at any of these screens. And so he's looking at the camera really closely, and he thinks he sees someone, he can't really tell, that has a hood on or a shroud on that's just sitting in the middle of the theater. And he can see clear as day a set of eyes. And before Morgan has a chance to do it, it just starts raising into the ceiling and disappears. Morgan didn't even check to see what it was. He was done. He literally quit that day. That was his last day at the theater. A couple of weeks after Morgan has quit and Dave is working alone at the theater, he's in the control room, and all of a sudden he hears a piano playing. And there's only one piano in the entire theater, and it's sitting in the basement. It's his job to protect this place, so he knows he has to go down and check because it could be some hooligan in the building somewhere. So he leaves the control room, and as he starts walking over to the stairs with his gun drawn, the music is getting louder and louder, the piano is getting louder and louder and louder. He makes his way down the steps, and as he's about to turn the corner, he hears the guard that protects the keys on the piano slam shut, and the piano stops. Then he turns around the corner and he looks, and there's no one down there. He flips on the light, no one's in the hall. He knows he's not going to find anyone down here. It's this entity that's causing all this mayhem inside of the theater. Dave's seen enough. He's done. He is done with this theater, and he goes right back upstairs. He goes in the control room, locks it, stays there till the end of his shift, and then he is out. And the next day, he goes to his sergeant and he says, "You can't ever put me back inside that theater or I will quit." And so sure enough, he was transferred. Over the next 2 months, they didn't have anyone who could do full-time security at the theater. So different random officers would be there for a couple hours, a couple of days a week, until November 26th. They found another officer, a veteran police officer named Josh Thomas, who was going to be working at the theater full-time. On November 26th, the first night that Josh Thomas was going to be there, he didn't have anyone to turn over with, so he was just alone at the theater. And it just so happens that Dave is in a patrol car near the theater. And when at some point in the night, Josh comes over the radio and says, "Hey, I need backup right now. Someone has broken into the theater." Dave knows that it's probably not someone breaking in. He knows what's going on inside that theater. He was the closest to it. And even though he did not want to go, he felt like it was his responsibility to go to that theater and be Josh's backup. And if it was what Dave thought it would be, this entity in the theater, that he would be able to explain to him what he had seen before he ultimately decided never to go back. And when Dave gets to the theater, there's this back door that they would go into, and he sees Josh is standing just outside the theater. And Dave would say that Josh's eyes were, like saucers. He looked terrified. And so Dave has an inkling of what's going on, and he goes over to Josh and he's like, "What's going on? Is someone still in there?" He said that he had been doing security rounds and he had heard what sounded like voices when he was in the basement, and he didn't think much of it. He checked all the rooms, everything was shut. And when he made his way up to the 3rd floor, he saw that the elevator had kicked on. It was in the basement, and suddenly the light was on and it was roaring up to the 3rd floor. And when the elevator opened up, there was no one there. And he's standing there looking at it, and he looks inside, there's no one there, and then the alarm goes off. That's when he called in for backup. Dave says, look, let's just go search the building, we'll do it together. They clear the whole theater, no one's there. And before Dave leaves, they go into the main auditorium where the stage is, and they're just standing on the stage chatting with each other. And Dave, his back is to where the audience would be. And Josh is facing Dave, facing towards the seats. Josh just suddenly stopped. Mid-sentence, he's just frozen and looking just beyond Dave's shoulder. And Dave goes, what? And Josh goes, there's something behind you. Dave slowly turns around, and as soon as he does, he can tell immediately what Josh is looking at. Standing in the very back of the theater away from them is a man standing in the corner with its hands by its sides. Its back is to them, and it's looking down with a hood over its head. Dave turns his whole body around to look at this thing right as this thing turns around real quick and looks directly at them. It has these deep, dark, sunken eyes, and its face looks like it had been very badly burned, like it was black and charred. And it's looking at them before it just turns and runs out the back of the theater. Josh believed that that was an intruder. Dave was fairly certain that that was just another example of this entity that haunts the theater. But they would search the building and they could never find that cloaked figure again. And that was when Dave sat Josh down in the control room and he filled him in on why Morgan had quit and why he ultimately had quit. And he also told him the story from Blair. So Josh is like, great, I'm glad I work here now. This was the last time that Dave would go to the theater. But Dave would do some additional digging on the history of the theater. It would turn out that in the 40s, there was this horrible fire, and a man had been trapped in the basement when the fire had erupted, and he had died inside of the theater. And so Dave would share this information with Morgan and with Josh, and the three of them all believed that what they were witnessing was the ghost of that man who died in that fire.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please put the Amazon Music follow button's feet in cement and throw them in the ocean. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen's. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen's Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites